Alright. I hope you are all prepared for the last couple games. We have Artemisia versus Wild Eyes. They both have US mid-range, they both have Brit Air, and they both have German Heinz. They have essentially the exact same lineup, slightly different versions of each deck. But largely they have the exact same decks, and there's no ban. It's a best of 5. So, game 1, we don't see Wild Eyes' mulligan, and... Oh, excuse me. Artemisia does not have German Heinz. Artemisia has German Control. My mistake. Okay. In that case, Artemisia, I believe, had the same lineup as Vinny. And Artemisia did not. And so, yeah, Artemisia had the exact same lineup as Vinny and banned the exact same way as Vinny. So here, against US midrange, you keep Sudden, you keep Brood out. Keeping Panzer 3L is interesting. I don't run that in my control list personally, but I can see why you would keep it, because, I mean, it's harder to retreat because it's a tank. It's harder to kill because it only really gets one shot by Hellcat, and if they throw a Hellcat into that, you're perfectly fine. So yeah, I think very smart in mulligan by Artemisia. We don't see Wild Eyes' mulligan. But he ends up with 30-second Whirlwind, 2 Shermans, PIR, and then top decks a second 30-second on turn 1, which is unfortunate. Here I just like a Rado over Sudden Strike. Because you have the Root Out follow-up, you know you're going to be able to play Root Out faster than your opponent can do it to protect a 35T or the additional 30 seconds. Yep, I also like this play with the PIR from Wild Eyes because the Whirlwinds have Blitz. They're tanks. They can move up later. If you play additional 30 seconds, I mean, they're just sitting in your support line. You play the PIR because the PIR is something that will increase its strength as time goes on. So instead of committing to a board that's going to get wiped out, you play a unit that is going to grow. Unfortunately, Artemisia has the Sudden Strike, and because this PIR does not die to the Root Out, you can see Artemisia immediately Sudden Strikes the PIR. Now the question is here is, do you hit face or do you trade? Well, you could theoretically move to the front line. You don't want to trade because you have Root Out, and you're also fine if your opponent spends additional credits, like moving that up. On the other hand, if you trade, your opponent has a very... It increases the likelihood your opponent's turn 3 play is to triple 30-second. Like, if you go face, your opponent knows you have Root Out and is going to play around it. But we're in a tournament, open deck lists, Wild Eyes is a good player. I think I would just trade. 30-second is weird because you just give your opponent the choice of spending a credit to kill it. Which I guess, like, buys you a credit, but this seems like the oddest of the solutions. But it actually works out very well. Maybe this is something he considered, even. Is Wild Eyes goes for the Whirlwind to kill it, which brings the Whirlwind to 2 health. And this turn, I just like Bologna Regiment. Or Bologna. I'm aware that that is not how it's pronounced. It's a joke. Because his opponent's still 1 turn from We Can Do It. You always have to play Root Out before We Can Do It becomes available, so he knows he's playing Root Out next turn. And if his opponent, like, half-tracks, if opponent does move up 99th, 32nd, Root Out's just a fine option. And your opponent also can't do move up Sherman yet. So here, this is a very tough spot for Wild Eyes, because he wants to draw with Sherman. He wants to kill this Bologna. He does not want to get blown out by Root Out. He does not have the retreat cards for this, so I think you do double move up, double 30-second. Because it guarantees your ability to do move up Sherman next turn if no Root Out is played, and if a Root Out is played, it's not killing everything. You still have Geberg's Pioneer and a 4th to 32nd in hand. And he plays 30-second, he does move up 1 30-second. Okay, so this play is also fair. I think this is... Well, with double Showman in hand, I think this play might be actually slightly better than the double 32nd, because you're more interested in making sure these Shermans draw than you are with the potential value of the Geburgs Pioneer. And if your opponent does trade into the 32nd, there's the risk that he has Flampanzer on the other 32nd, but then you get your Geburgs Pioneer alive. So it is a slightly riskier play, but I think it's a smart risk to take. Of course, Root Out is just an easy play for Artemisia here. Stop any Shermans, stop any We Can Do It. Combat Engineers is an interesting draw. I would do Combat, move up Whirlwind, 32nd. Or Combat, move up Whirlwind, attack. Both of those plays are interesting. The risk of doing move up is your opponent has Sudden Strike and then moves the 2/5 to the front line, in which case you're in a terrible spot because Hellcat can no longer get buffed by the Combat Engineers to kill it. Yeah, that thing is always happening, move up. And he does decide to not to attack, so this does get hard punished by Sudden Strike. But this play is better because you don't really want to move your Combat Engineers to draw with Sherman. And here Artemisia has a lot of choices. This German control deck gets a lot of choices around this credit slot. So he can do Panzer 3L attack, Whirlwind. Oh, sorry, Whirlwind's in the front line. Whirlwind will pin any of the 3 planes, or the 2 planes in his hand. So this turn is actually not as complicated as previously stated as Panzer L trade. I forgot about the Whirlwind pin effect for a second. But this opens Wild Eyes to do move up Sherman. He could even do second Combat Engineers move up Sherman. You've seen one Root Out. You know there's no Kuiper Bomb. He's an Italian ally. I actually do like the second Combat Engineers. I would do Combat Engineers move up Sherman. And you see Wild Eyes is thinking about it. It could be worth playing the 32nd. Decides against it. Sherman. So now he has 3 Shermans and a We Can Do It. This game is getting very interesting. It's very up in the air. So here, Artemisia can do trade, move up, trade. Remove the Sherman, remove the 32nd. That seems pretty decent. You don't want to retreat the Sherman, so there's not really a great FW play. You wouldn't mind getting the JU out, but you're still vulnerable to retreat. Wouldn't mind getting a Wolf Pack out, but this is too early to be Wolf Packing. So yeah, I do actually just like double trading. It doesn't feel great, but all of your other plays could potentially get blown out by retreat guides. Like at this point, you just want to like make sure you don't die on. Like you want to buy as much time as possible to draw your swinging cards. Like you want to find Leopolds, to find your Flampanzers. So here, I think Wild Eye should do move up Sherman. There's the possibility to do 32nd, We Can Do It, but I like this more. Panzer 35T, I would value your Combat Engineers over the 35T, so I think this trade here is correct. Here is an interesting play, because you can retreat this Combat Engineers, but it comes down and its effect still applies. You can retreat the Sherman, but it comes down and draws more. I think Line for a Day needs to come out on Sherman, which means you're left with 4 credits, which means you're probably just going to hold up the from the deep, which means you want to play Africa Corps first. So you should start with Africa Corps into Line for a Day, hold up from the deep. So does Line for a Day, holds up from the deep, and Africa Corps is last. And again, this is something where you should just be able to stop, think through your turn, what are you going to do, and if there's anything that requires choosing between cards, if there's anything that requires drawing cards, you do those first. Most of the time. There's a few exceptions, but as a general rule, it's always better to do this first. And as we see, he actually got the Nakshub. So what he could have done is, if he had played this first, he goes down to 6 credits, picks Nakshub, goes down to 5 credits, played Nakshub, Lines for a Day, goes up to 3, And then, I mean, he doesn't actually have anything to play for 3 credits. Sorry, I was thinking that he would have more credits than that left over at the end. But, like, again, that is a potential example of why Nakshub is, or sorry, why playing Africa Core first is important. If he had a envelop in his front or in his hand, if he had done the Nakshub first, he could pick Nakshub, hold up envelop, his opponent moves to the front line, and it kills the combat engineers. It like completely nullifies the effect of the combat engineers. Of course, that's not the case. I actually think you should pick the Panzerzug here. It's the weirdest option, but your hand is not exactly removal heavy, so the Shub is not going to be getting a ton of value. The Tiger IE is just a massive retreat bait. He doesn't have the Mare Nostrum yet either. So I just think Panzerzug is the best option here. Does not pick it, which I think is a pretty big mistake. I think Tiger IE is actually arguably the worst of the cards that was offered there. Here, again, you just want to keep these Shermans rolling and move up the First Marines. Could he have potentially played around this? Yeah. Yeah, I think he should have done Geberg's Pioneer, Sherman, into 32nd, move up the other combat engineers, and hit face for 2. Like this, with so many 1-drops in your deck, there's not really an excuse to not be playing around from the deep, especially so early in a game. It's not like Artemisia is low on cards and passed with like 5 credits. And with Panther G's in the deck, this is actually, like, Artemisia's hand right now is 3 units that have no on-play effects, and he doesn't have a Mare Nostrum. So I don't understand why he wouldn't pick the Panzerzug to get the Blitz guys, because that lets you like fight into the support line, or sorry, to the front line. Here is just really awkward. You have 9 credits, but you can only play 1 card. And I think that's just got to be the FW. Retreat the First Marines back to hand. Like, Tiger IE just gets so hard punished by 99th, and your opponent's drawn about half their deck. And even if it doesn't get punished by 99th, it can get one-shot by Hellcat. And Wild Eyes has a ton of burst in his hand right now. So just from hand, Wild Eyes can deal 17 damage from hand. He can deal 10 damage and retreat the Tiger IE. Like, this is insane. Wild Eyes is completely winning this game. Retreats. Here, I think I would play out the Hellcat, hit face for, what is that? You would be hitting face for 13, bring your opponent to 7, with 35T and Hellcat in hand. Because you can't play the We Can Do It because of Leopold, the threat of Leopold. That's really the only thing you lose for 2 right now. And yep, he brings him to 7, and there's just absolutely nothing. Wild Eyes seems very mad. Hold on. If you look at what's going on in I'm a bit confused. I don't know if he's angry. Okay, Surrender comes through. Maybe he was happy. But Wild Eyes goes up 1-0. Here we got both mulligans again. It's German control again, but this time it's against Wild Eyes' German Heinz deck. So it's actually somewhat similar. There's less draw because there's no Shermans, but there's like more aggressiveness because there's a lot of these buff cards, and there's the Greif. So from Artemisia's point of view, I would just send back Leopold, keep the other 3. This is an insanely good hand. From Wild Eyes' point of view, send back the Flampanzer, send back the We Can Do It. Actually, maybe don't send back the We Can Do It. You have double Geberg's Pioneer. I would go as far as to consider keeping Flampanzer. Well, he runs a lot of buffs, though, so it's not as necessarily important to keep this We Can Do It specifically. But I think I would just send back Flampanzer and keep the other. Well, actually, you could even full keep. Because if he keeps Geberg's Pioneer, he plays Geberg's Pioneer on 1, his opponent plays a Ratto on 2 to draw, and then he does on 2 Flampanzer to kill a Ratto and keep the Geberg's Pioneer alive. maybe it's a bit overcommittal to keep the we can do it, because you are going second, and your opponent's almost certainly going to be able to remove one of these Geburg's Pioneers. But I really do like keeping the Flampanzer. Gets a we can do it back and a Panzer H. On the other side of the board, it looks like Artemisia. Artemisia sent back Rudo. That's interesting. It's because the Heinz deck has so many 3 health units, but I still think just keeping it for the permanent debuff and the threat of there is a decent amount of 2 health units in the deck too. I don't see why you wouldn't keep Root out. He has the Sudden Strike. Here, Wild Eyes should just play Combat Geburgs. Like, you need to get on board, but you also don't want to overcommit. But this is just going to lead into... draws the Root out right on curve anyways. I would do Flying Bomb Pass, because you know your opponent isn't going to be able to play a We Can Do It or an Alliance yet. And that's exactly what he does. That is filthy. So Wild Eyes has to know the Root Out is coming, so he should just do Panzer 3H. Get the draw. That's exactly what he does. Unfortunately, we don't get to see what he's picking. But it gets a second Panzer 3H, which is a good choice. Like, these units can prove to be very annoying for Germany to deal with, because they don't have a ton of removal, and your deck is based around buffing these things. Like, a 2-4 can turn into a 3-5, which can turn into a 3-8, which can turn pretty easily into a 5-10. Like, that's Alliance Panzer H, or not Panzer H, the Panzer G, whatever the buff one is. Gets a fast Heinz. This hand's looking very good, very fast, and Artemisia gets a on-curve top deck Wolf Pack 1 in 6 discard Heinz. That is, I mean, that speaks for itself. Wolfpack's the correct play to make there, and that's just so unfortunate for Wild Eyes. Like, you want to get this We Can Do It out, but at the same time, you want to get this Greif Befelswagen out, but at the same time, you know it doesn't matter if those are buffed, because there's a Flying Bomb sitting in your opponent's hand. So I would just play We Can Do It here. Hope to find an alliance. Looks like he's instead going to commit. This is fine, because you know one of these units is going to die to Flying Bomb anyways, but you're hitting your opponent in the face. Oh, he isn't going for the 35T, even. I mean, I guess he thinks that he needs to get the most value out of this buff as possible, which is fair. I like the other play because if you got an alliance, or if you got a Panzer G, which is, I believe is what the card called, yeah, but this Flying Bomb Hipper with the Befelswagen is actually really funny. It's the correct play, but it's also really funny because the support line is, or the front line is full and is going to stay full, so this unit has to come out for 2 and just sit. And now Wild Eyes can play the We Can Do It, hit face for 3. He's not like that far behind. Like, he's really just one alliance away from winning, to be honest. Like, if this was Alliance instead of We Can Do It, I think he just wins the game. Right there. And top deck Annihilation on 7. He already has one in hand, but, like, his opponent's low on cards. And you top deck a kill their largest unit and make them discard one of the 3 cards in hand. 22nd here is very good. And, like, you need to play out the Flampanzer. You need to get as much pressure on the board. I'm going through these turns very quick, but these turns are kind of playing themselves. I would go for the JU and then Tactical Strike the Flampanzer. Although I guess you could keep the Flampanzer around so you can do JU into Flampanzer and then play his Flampanzer. That play's not terrible. You could also just play out the Decima if you want to conserve health. Like, Artemisia has a lot of... I think the Annihilation is the worst play. You need to get a unit on board. But between Decima and JU Tac Strike, you're terrified of Alliance, but you know your opponent would have played it if he drew it. So your opponent's had 2 draws for Alliance. I think I would just still do the JU Tac Strike the 2-1 maybe. Because you're preventing draws, you are saying that if he gets the tank buffs, he gets the tank buffs, but at the same time, even if he gets the 1/1 buff, you can still trade JU and kill the Greif with it. If he gets the Alliance, you can Lion for a day. The Flame Panzer. I think you have to go for the JU. Well, you don't have to. Dechima's fine, but the JU play is just much better because it gets you on board. And that's exactly what he ends up doing. JU, Tack Strike, the 2/1. Artemisia is playing very well, I think. Here, I would do the we can do it, keep things out of JU range, and then you hit face for 4. And the Panzer F, that's what it's called, not Panzer G. Panzer F. And here, just annihilate the biggest thing. Oh, and hits the Panzer F. I mean, they're both playing well, but Artemisia's discards have just been brutal this game. You got the choice between holding up from the deep and attacking. If you hold up from the deep, your opponent knows you have it for a fact. But on the reverse side, your opponent does not have the cards to be playing around it. I still think I would just attack the 1/8. The reason he does 38T here is Wild Eyes knows the opponent has a from the deep, so normally you would think, well, you should play the Befehlswagen. But Wild Eyes has the Alliances still in his deck, and he could have potential Panzer Fs. There's a good chance you'll want to play the card you draw into more than the Befehlswagen, so it's fine that you sacrifice the slightly larger unit into the from the deep. And in this case, he does get the Panzer 35T, which lets him pressure face. The fact that he ends up playing the Befehlswagen anyways means if you look exclusively at the outcome, it would have been better to play Befehlswagen first. But you shouldn't always just be results oriented and thinking about like what was right, what was wrong. Because just because something didn't work out that way doesn't mean it was wrong. Like, so for example, if there's a play that's correct 80% of the time and then the 20% happens, it doesn't mean that the play was wrong. And at the same time, if you make a play that works 20% of the time instead of the play that works 80% of the time and the 20% happens, it doesn't mean that you were right. So yeah, Dechima and kill the other 2/2. You just want to remove as many units as possible to avoid dying to a buff. 99th here, I think you have to 99th Dechima and go face for 2. Like, I don't see a way you win this game where you retreat the JU. Because assume Dechima is the only card or the only guard in his hand. It means he has to replay Dechima. And if he doesn't have a way to kill your units before, he's probably not going to have a way to kill them now with 1 extra credit. So it stops the Mary Nostrum heal. And then you know you have Leopold to bring him to, like you can play Leopold attack with the 1/8, so you can bring him to 3 health. And then he's forced to do Dechima onto Leopold. Doesn't have the JU on board this time, and then you could win with like an alliance. I think you just have more winning chances by retreating the Dechima and going face for 2 there than you do with this line. And here, Panzer 3H, and he just gets anything he wants, really. Like, Mary Nostrum to heal, root out to bring all of these units to 0 attack. He can Flam Panzer to kill the Greif. I mean, I think I probably would have picked Flam Panzer there. Personally. Because this Mary Nostrum's not the most effective. Actually, that's not true. He can kill the Greif. He can kill the Greif. Because you can do 35T Mary Nostrum. And then just kill the Greif. And Wild Eyes, you just have to play Leopold here. there's not really... Well, I don't actually know if that's true. Because if you play Leopold, he just immediately Detrimas. And then you're kind of in the exact same losing position. But if you Wild Eyes here, you're dead anyways. But you can't play Leopold here now. You have to kill the Detrima. Because the only way you win is if Leopold does not get responded to. So yeah, kill the Detrima. Move up. You're going to play Alliance because you need to make sure this Panzer 35T does not heal any more than 2. Or, like, any more than 3, sorry. Panzer L. Attack. He is slightly off full clearing the board. Wait, is that true? Can he full clear the board with the JU? So the JU brings its attack up to 4. And then he has... Yeah, he can just full clear the board, actually, with the JU. That's a filthy top deck. He has this useless Sky Barons that's been sitting in hand the whole game, but he does have this Line for a Day, which will immediately respond to the Leopold. Blitzkrieg. Yeah, I mean, we've seen it before in this tournament. Blitzkrieg just comes a little bit too late. Leopold gets played. Line for a Day gets played. There's nothing Wild Eyes can do. We're just going to skip to the end of this, like Wild Eyes. He's a frontline deck with no cards and no frontline. And in the end, Artemisia's healed back to 18. So that ties the game up, or the series up at 1-1. And we go into game 3. It is Air against this Heinz deck again. Getting rid of Convoy, keeping Kitty Hawk, Swordfish, Finest Hour. I think this mulligan's fine. The Finest Hour would be the most odd, like the part that stands out the most to me. But it's better than no buff. Like, keeping a subpar buff is better than keeping no buff. So I think this mulligan is fine from Artemisia's point of view. On the other side, this is just a very good hand from Wild Eyes. I think I would keep the 22nd, because your other 3 cards are very good, and your No Britain is never going to contest you for the front line. So keeping 22nd is sort of just like, yeah, and you can see he's thinking about it. I like these mulligans by both players. And in the end, he does keep it. So Artemisia goes first, and because he goes first, Wild Eyes can't play the Geburgs Pioneer. So instead, he plays the Panzer A, and Artemisia follows it up with the second 1-drop and Air Superiority. So here, Wild Eyes, he really just has to play Panzer A and pass. Like, the Geburgs Pioneer dies instantly. 22nd Infantry dies instantly. The Whirlwind doesn't die instantly on board, but gets really hard punished by a few things. Wild Eyes chooses to play out the Geburgs Pioneer, and the idea behind this is it forces his opponent to attack. And by forcing his opponent to attack, it means he's going to have access to only 2 credits instead of 3, which means Hurricane can't come out. So that's the mentality behind it. Like, it's not a terrible play. It's not like he's just accidentally sacrificed a unit to the Bomber Gods. I don't think I would have made that play in this situation, because I think you're still fine if your opponent plays a Hurricane because of this Pursuit in hand. And there's times you could play the Geburgs Pioneer where you have more units on board, and your opponent has to choose between units to kill. Unfortunately, Artemisia just has this Kitty Hawk, which he should play. Like, you have Calm Before the Storm in hand, so you want to get as many units on board as quickly as possible. And also, Kitty Hawk just... Okay, well, chooses not to. I don't understand why. So, well, the idea is you want to block the front line. But your opponent, on 3 credits, what is your opponent going to do against this with a 1-3 tank? He could do move up... Okay, I guess he could do move up Fast Heinz attack, and if there's also a beef combined in that variation, you're behind by a lot. So, yeah, if you choose to bomb the 1-1, moving up is correct. I still think Kitty Hawk is just better, in my opinion, because you have your Calm Before the Storm. So, you know you have a crazy buff in hand, and you're worried about your opponent potentially having a crazy buff in hand. So I feel like you should just go with what you know, and it's even if your opponent does have the beef with the fast hinds, your calm before the storm just answers that. So I don't know. I guess after that he could follow it up with Flampanzer. So like worst case scenario, the Kitty Hawk play gets really hard punished, but this play doesn't look great. I mean, Wild Eyes here. I don't really know what you do here. Um, this is not a good position you want to be in. I guess you just play Panzer F. The other option would be Whirlwind Attack, but I don't like that quite as much. You could do Whirlwind Attack with the 1-3. And then your opponent has the choice between which to kill if they have like a buff. But then if your opponent has Air Sup, you get super hard punished because your entire board's gone and neither plane is dead. I like the Panzer F play the most. Let's see what he does. Ropes it out, does Warble Attack. And this works out perfectly for Artemisia because he has this Kitty Hawk in hand. He's thinking about the finest out, but this has got to be Kitty Hawk. Yep, save your buffs. Get as many units on the board as possible if you have calm before the storm in hand. And this Kitty Hawk's deployment effect is not like the greatest thing in the world. So here Wild Eyes is starting to get some options. He can do half-track the bomber, kill the fighter in the front line. He can do pursuit the bomber, kill the fighter in the front line, and take the front line. You probably... It's fine to play one of the retreat cards in hand because he has two. If he only had one retreat card in hand, he should save it. Because, like, if a buff comes out. He can do Panzer F, kill the 1-1. I think I like that play the most because it doesn't leave you too vulnerable to various lines where Artemisia plays a buff, and you make sure you can if the buff play does come out, you have a retreat follow-up where you sort of take control of the board. This is easy finest now. We kill the 3-3, move up the Kitty Hawk. That's exactly what Artemisia does. Artemisia's play was very on point this tournament. There's no line where you can kill the bomber if you retreat the Kitty Hawk, so you just have to retreat the bomber. And the best way to do that is half-track, and then I'd play 22nd. And he's going to get punished by shelling, but chooses not to. Chooses to trade. I mean, I guess he gets punished by shelling either way. I would have played 22nd infantry there because you need to just commit to the board and hope your opponent doesn't have a board clear, because at this point, if the bomber comes down, you still don't have a way to kill it. I mean, he doesn't even have to go for the shelling, but I do think the best play is probably just shelling Swordfish. He's thinking about Wellington. Okay, yeah, shelling Swordfish, Artemisia, I think makes the best play again. Wild Eyes still is slightly off of drawing with this 22nd. Still can't kill the bomber. I think maybe I would have done... Well, this is fine, I guess. Because you keep the Pursuit in hand, you keep the Leopold in hand. Maybe you can make like a comeback if you draw another Blitz card, and then you can Pursuit, take the front line, kill something, and draw. That seems very hopeful. Here, Artemisia, I think, should kill the half-track and kill the 22nd with Mosquito. You could go for the Wellington play, if you prefer, but I like the Mosquito more. Chooses to kill the Greif over the half-track. Artemisia seems to have a read that Wild Eyes has Hinds in hand. Like, fast Hinds. And I guess there's, like, alliance potential. But there's also just combat engineers, which seems like it's more likely than the other lines. And, yeah, I would have killed the half track here for sure. I think your opponent has shown pretty conclusively that they do not have blitz German tanks in hand, because if they did, they would be playing them. um, yeah, we can do it. Move up. This is the best you can do. At this point, you just have to like survive till Leopold, and then hope Leopold can carry. Artemisia moving the Mosquito to the front line to protect the bombers, and he's setting up for all face comm before the storm, and because of the shelling and Artemisia going first, Wild Eyes is just not going to live long enough to get the Leopold off. Artemisia can just do... Yeah, I'd do Swordfish hit face for 7 comm before the storm. And the reason you would do this over attack once Spitfire comm before the storm is, like, if you get half-tracked, this gets more damage through. Like, this is more damage if your opponent has half-track now than if you did the attack once Spitfire comm before the storm and Spitfire gets half-tracked. And also, having Spitfire in hand just means if you ever draw Finest Hour, you win the game. Wild Eyes knows it's lost and surrenders, and it goes 2-1 up for Artemisia. And we get into Game 3 of US Midrange now for the third attempt for this Heinz deck to win. This Heinz deck has lost twice in a row. From Wild Eyes, for Artemisia, I would keep the 35T and send back the other 3. Normally I would not keep the 35T unless the you had a 1-drop, but the US deck runs 8 1-drop infantries. So, like, you can afford to keep 35T usually. And then on the other side of the board, Wild Eyes, you have to keep Flampanzer. You have to send back Enigma, you have to send back Leopold. Well, you could consider keeping Leopold, because Leopold is a massive card against the US midrange. The problem is you're going second again. Like, Artemisia has gone first, I think, twice in a row now against Heinz. And Whirlwind, Panzer F are both fine cards. You do want a 1-drop, though. To be completely honest, I don't have enough experience on Heinz to say conclusively how he should mulligan. If I was in this position, I would send back Enigma. I would send back Panzer F. And I would keep Leopold, Flampanzer, Whirlwind. But I am certainly not saying that that is just the objectively best mulligan, because I do not play enough Heinz. And we see Artemisia does the exact mulligan I suggested. Wild Eyes actually sends back Flampanzer along with Leopold. This one I'm not sure about, because US runs a lot of 1-drops. Actually, sorry, the US deck runs 10. I forgot about Geburg's Pioneer. The US runs 10 1-cost infantries. Unfortunately for Artemisia, he got back 2 Sherman, 3 Shermans, and a Stars and Stripes. And Wild Eyes gets the Geburg's Pioneer start. Whirlwind to the front line to protect the Geburgs. Artemisia still has nothing to play, and this is just an example of, I mean, it's over. Artemisia just got completely shafted on the mulligan, like not being able to play one thing from turns 1 to 3. Like, he's floated 3 of his first 6 credits in an aggro deck, and Wild Eyes has double Geburgs. Like, this game is truly over. You can do 99th Panzer F, you can do Alliance, like, you can do Pursuit. I like the 99th Panzer F play the most, because you know your opponent doesn't have... Well, your opponent might have Hellcat, your opponent might have First Marines. First Marines there would have almost certainly been better than Sherman. So you're confident your opponent doesn't have First Marines. moves up the Geburgs Pioneer to play around Stars and Stripes, which means he can still get this alliance off and hit face for 5. I do think hitting face for 5 is better than getting an additional 1-3, because these units in the front line are going to live for a very long time. And just setting up 2-turn lethal is much better than getting an extra 3-5. And this game is just over. I believe this is just lethal. Not quite. He brings Artemisia to 2. Artemisia still has absolutely nothing. And this is the strength of the Hinds combined with Artemisia just getting completely bricked. And that goes to game 5. Not much to say about that game. I mean, to be honest, there was very little decision making going on there. Like Wild Eyes moved up the Geburgs Pioneer to play around Stars and Stripes. That was intelligent. That could have led to a potential comeback. And game 5 comes down between US midrange and air. Now here, wow. Artemisia has a very good hand. I wouldn't hate keeping this entire hand. Maybe send back First Marines. I don't believe he's running Flampanzer, so these half-tracks are very important. And on Wild Eyes' side, I would send back Finest Hour and keep the other 3. HMS Illustrious is just such a powerful card that you probably want to keep it every time you see it. I don't like this mulligan. I understand he's thinking he needs to mulligan for Swordfish, which is, it's very good to mulligan for Swordfish, but I don't think it's as important as Wild Eyes thinks. I think getting just an HMS close air support on turn 5 is perfectly fine to come back into a game. You have air superiority in case he has Geburgs. And now he has the 1-drop, but if you look, the other cards in his hand are just so underwhelming. Like, it was way better to just keep what he had. And I didn't see Artemisia. Yeah, Artemisia just sent back the First Marines. Exact same mulligan I would have done. So Wild Eyes plays the 1-drop. Here, Artemisia chooses to play Red Devils first again. Here it's slightly different because 32nd gets Albacord, whereas Red Devils doesn't. Also, if your opponent wants to hit the Red Devils with his plane, it's more expensive. If your opponent wants to play air superiority, it takes up his whole turn. So Red Devils first is actually correct in this situation, but the last time he did Red Devils first, it was better to do 32nd. Now, Wild Eyes, you just need to air superiority it. Try to keep control of the board long enough to get the Hurricane down and potentially win on that, because he's down so far on cards. Like, he started first, but he just doesn't have, like, a snowball hand. Here you just Hurricane. Like, you can't afford to take your pedal off the gas. Or your foot off the pedal. The gas pedal. That is how that expression goes. Against air. Here, I'm not a huge fan of Artemisia's play. I think I would have just half-tracked if I were in his spot, because if you half-track, you have the follow-up combat engineers move up half-track, kill the Hurricane. And with this play, you're like, you're entering the realm of possibility where there's a few plays that could potentially just blow you out. Very fortunate for him, though, the PIR hits the 32nd, so Wild Eyes can't double trade. Very fortunate for him. There's the possibility that Wild Eyes should just hit face for 6. Like, I think if he does, he risks dying. Just looking at Artemisia's hand. But at the same time, I don't see how you win trading. And he has, like, follow-up shelling into Wellington. I think you just hit face for 6, because you follow it up by playing shelling, and then you can follow it up by playing Wellington attack on 6. And maybe your strategy turns into fight for the board again. Maybe your strategy turns to pressing face, depending on how you draw look in the next couple of turns, and depending on how what your opponent plays in the next couple of turns. But I think you just have to hit face 6. with the Hurricane, and that's a difficult play to make. Like, your opponent has a 5-3 in the front line. He can also do hit face once and then hit the 5-3, but I think you're sacrificing too much. The Combat Engineers is on the board, so a Whirlwind or a 35T just blows you out. I think you just have to go face. And that's what he does. I think Wild Eyes made the very difficult but important decision. And Artemisia top decks 35T. And, I mean, that is just so powerful. You can see Wild Eyes reacts. He knows that he went for a risky line. I think it was the correct line. And now he's getting hard punished. Artemisia goes face for 5 instead of even killing the plane. Now Wild Eyes just has Shelling. And it's not over yet. He has Convoy. His opponent's on 14, so he has, like, Spitfire Finest Hour or Hurricane Finest Hour win conditions later in the game. Not playing Shelling here, I think, is a huge mistake. Because your opponent's threatening 12 damage. Like, your opponent could just straight up kill you if you didn't find the Albacore. Well, okay, I guess you can trade the 1-3 plane. But your opponent's still threatening 7. Like, you have to... I don't really see why you don't play Shelling there. Artemisia, unfortunately, draws 32nd. Draws last. There's no card you could have found off of Sherman that would make you not attack face there, but it's still just a good habit to draw first. And Wild Eyes actually finds the Spitfire. So, I'd just like to point out, if he had done Shelling last turn... So, if he had done Shelling in this position instead of playing Convoy, the Wellington would still cost 4. The 5-1 would be dead. Sherman would be on the board, but it would just be Sherman because he would be down a credit. And then he would have follow-up Wellington kill the 9-5. And, like, that could get punished by things. Like, it could just be killed by the Sherman, but, like, you're still at 15 health, and your opponent has been slowed down drastically. And then you can play double Convoy, and you find Spitfires, you find Swordfish, you find the Albacore, and you're up at 15 health instead of at 8 health. Artemisia here, he has a couple of choices, but in the end, I think you just want to get as much to the front line as possible, because he has the Hellcat to finish off. So I would do first Marines move up, and then probably 22nd. Because the first Marine stops him from going face to set up like some sort of 2-turn lethal. 22nd just draws you a card deep when you attack. You're probably not going to want the double 30 seconds, and that actually board locks you from playing Hellcat next turn. And now he has a clear 2-turn setup lethal, where he uses Hellcat, bring Wild Eyes. Actually, no, sorry, Hellcat would only deal 5, so it's not a 2-turn lethal setup yet. But Wild Eyes has to play Shelling here. You can do Shelling, close air support, kill the first Marines even. Yeah, and you're actually like starting to fight back into the game. So here, from Wild Eyes' point of view, this game is close. Like, you could win. You're a couple cards away from just winning. Unfortunately, Artemisia does have the Hellcat, and you do have to do Hellcat into the bomber here. The alternate play could be... Well, no, because you don't want to get blown out by Empire Strikes. You have to do Hellcat into the bomber. And this is the play of the tournament I disagree with by far the most from Artemisia. He does Hellcat face. Here, if your opponent has... Oh, and Wild Eyes finds the finest out. So Wild Eyes just wins the game in 2 turns if he can deal a small amount of damage. Unfortunately for Wild Eyes, he does not have the ability to clear the board. If he had Empire Strikes here, he would clear the board and move units to the front line and bring Artemisia into range of lethal in 2 turns. Artemisia is just sort of like bet at all on this Hellcat face play. And Wild Eyes thinks that Artemisia probably just has strategic bombing in hand. Like, he's probably just thinking, I'm going to die anyways. Like, my opponent brought me to 3 for a reason. Unfortunately, for Artemisia, though, there is no reason. Like, there was really just no reason for that. And he could easily just lose the game from this position. Like, all of a sudden, this game is close. All of a sudden, Wild Eyes has an overwhelming presence on the board. Wild Eyes has a 2-turn setup for lethal, and Artemisia does not have any blitz tanks in hand. He has 0 way of dealing that 3 damage. He can deal 2 damage with the 101st, but that's not too helpful right now. He can get a unit to the front line, but he can't draw with it. Like, he can't get a Sherman with it. I don't really know what we would do here in this situation, because if you flood the board, the bombers are just going to destroy everything. You could do We Can Do It to try to find strat bombing. Like, you have to assume your opponent's not going to let you. You have to assume your opponent's not going to let you, like, get any units to the front line anytime soon. There's half track on the 1-3 plane, like the Gladiator, to move it back. And you can take the front line. There's half track on the Arado to just try to get rid of as much stats on the board as possible, because this Wellington will still cost 0 if sent back to hand. I mean, I like retreating the Arado, retreating the Gladiator, and then moving to the front line with a unit. Because then you have 2 tanks in the back line, a unit in the front line, and your opponent has the capabilities of removing all of that in hand. But here, Wild Eyes can... I don't know if he can set up lethal while stopping death to half track. Or not half track, to Hellcat. Because Artemisia still has 1 half track in hand, a Hellcat top deck will still be lethal through 1 unit in the support line, or front line, sorry. Wild Eyes can do HMS, double move up for 5, and then kill 2 units. That would stop Hellcat lethal, but it would not set up lethal with Spitfire. Because you need to deal 2 damage to the opponent to set up lethal with Spitfire. Maybe these 30 seconds are fine, because if your opponent does... Like, the Combat Engineers is dead, right? So if your opponent does move up Sherman, they now have 3 credits to deal 3 damage, which is not possible in that deck unless it's exactly Combat Engineers 35T. Whereas... And that sets up your 2-turn lethal. You are afraid of Wirblewind. You need to kill the half track because it's a tank. So we could do hit face with Wellington, Arado, the half track, move up. That's a possibility. There's also HMS Illustrious, double attack into the half track, move up face. There's Arado, or Albacore plays you can make. He chooses to get rid of the half track immediately. If you don't put your opponent to 12, you can't win next turn. This is a way of getting around some of the credit problems by just throwing it on the board. Obviously, your opponent can't kill it, with the exception of second half track, or they somehow take the front line 99th. And Artemisia does have second half track in hand, so he does buy himself a turn, but it does not matter because he top decks one of 2 cards in his deck that would be lethal. He has second Hellcat with half track, second Hellcat move up, or strategic bombing. And he top decks strategic bombing, which is deeply unfortunate by Wild Eyes. I think Artemisia made the biggest mistake of the tournament by going Hellcat face instead of Hellcat into the Albacore, and then he top decks Strategic Bombing to avoid being punished by it. And he takes third place 3-2 over Wild Eyes. So that brings us to a bracket looking like this. And we move on into the finals, myself versus Dion.